Thank you so much for the lovely introduction. It's a great honor to be here. I've heard of Olivia's conference for many years, and I'm so happy to be part of it. So today's topic, the long-lasting effects of crisis and other past experiences on expectations and economic decision, links in some sense to all the various topics being discussed and areas of research presented at the conference, because a lot of it revolves around expectation formation. I mean, just in the discussion right now, beliefs about returns to education came up, beliefs about financial ability, future earnings, etc. And what we are trying to do in our research agenda on experience effect is to help economists get to a more realistic picture of how people think about risk and how they form beliefs. And to introduce it, let me start from something we're all very aware of right now, namely the effect of the COVID-19 pandemic on our behavior. So when you look at what economists have started studying in their research as we were entering and going through this pandemic, there were obviously a lot of papers on the immediate effect of the pandemic on our consumption choice and financial choices due to less interaction at work and stores. We didn't see our physician in person, telemedicine came up, we all subscribed to yoga and HIIT apps. As a finance person, I was very curious about the increase in trading. As the Wall Street Journal declared at some point, everyone's a day trader now. So that was the short term. Now, of course, economists also have immediately thought about the longer term implications for aspects such as how the job loss in certain areas, education choices, schools changes in testing and admission, etc., would affect our longer term, income, wealth accumulation, etc., was obviously on everybody's agenda. Now, what I'm here to talk about is different from those traditional types of analysis we economists pursue. I'm interested in the very long run, the longer run impact of an experience such as living through the pandemic. And I'm interested in the impact going beyond these changes, these very tangible changes in job availability, health measures, etc. I'm asking, are there ceteris paribus, as we economists like to talk about, changes in our behavior that are here to stay, which are a result of the experience of having lived through this pandemic? And can we predict these changes? Can we relate them to how strongly we have been affected by the pandemic? So to further clarify what I have in mind here, let's do a little exercise in magical thinking. And suppose we live in a country where the entire population is vaccinated and boosted, and the vaccine is effective against all variants of the virus. We've all returned to our pre-pandemic job situation or earnings situation. Earnings and wealth prospects are as if the pandemic did not happen, and the impact on accumulated wealth is minimal. We're holding our seminars and conferences in person rather than via Zoom. So basically, we are back to a world pre-COVID-19. And the question is whether under these magical assumptions, we would be back to economic decision-making and financial risk-taking from the pre-COVID-19 era. That's, in some sense, what the mere focus on these short and medium-run implications we economists traditionally think about would imply, right? If we reestablish everything as it was before, we would be making the same decisions as we would have made them before the pandemic, if the pandemic had never happened. But, to be clear, I'm not saying that this is what economists are arguing, but typically the arguments rely on economic conditions having changed, industries having changed, etc. But my question here is, what about we having changed, we behaving differently, having different worldviews, forming different beliefs compared to who we were pre-pandemic? And if you look a little bit, if I can take you to some historical periods for just a second, for just to slide, if you look back at epidemics such as, fairly recently, HIV/AIDS, 100 years ago, influenza, but then even earlier, tuberculosis, bubonic plagues, Middle Ages, clearly we know that these have been essential in affecting historical outcomes. So their role, if you read the history books, are on par with war, religion, high culture, etc. But typically, these history textbooks, and for sure economic history textbooks, point again to tangible variables such as, the Black Death transforming demography in Europe between the 14th and 16th century, changes in GDP, changes in trade pattern, trade routes, financial capital available. But there's something else. There's a change in worldviews and beliefs happening around that time. So to zoom into one historical example, the Black Death I just mentioned. So when, Europe was suffering from the Black Death for decades and centuries, it did not only affect these concrete, tangible outcomes, it also affected beliefs. And with beliefs, I don't mean what's listed here on top, the medical belief. So it's really interesting. If you read up on it, very parallel to what we went through with the coronavirus in the beginning. People thinking about what surfaces this may attach more, and whether wearing leather and wax fabrics, as this doctor here is wearing on the right, helps. The role of masks, pretty funny masks compared to the ones we were wearing, etc. But so that was interesting. But what I'm after here is about, it might be in the form of religious beliefs, but more broadly, a worldviews. There was a substantial influence on how people viewed the world. There was a new piety, cult of plague saints. Back home in Germany, we have these famous passion plays. They're actually happening this year, happening every year, but since then in Oberammergau. And also it was the beginning of the modern theodicy discussion. So as the Yale researcher Frank Snowden, who very famous lectures on epidemics and society and has a very cool book about it, says the result of this big epidemic was, not so much atheism, but just new despair that was often barely articulated, something he would call, with some historical hindsight and anachronism, post-traumatic stress. And people's attitudes towards, for example, investing in themselves, investing in their education, changed as a result of having lived through that. So, this is very historical, this is a very big picture, but I hope it gives you a sense of what I think is really important in the real world, that experiences such as pandemics, crises, etc., turn us into somewhat different people with somewhat different risk attitudes and beliefs and different manner in which we form beliefs. And that's something traditional models of economic decision-making have a hard time handling. So in traditional models, actually including many behavioral models, and I'm a proud card-carrying member of the behavioral economics club, but even in many of those models, the effect of personally experiencing something, a personally experienced pandemic or crisis, is no different from being informed about what happened, what are the implications, what are the probabilities of that happening again. Of course, ceteris paribus. So, for example, living through a depression should not affect financial investment any different than the fact of reading about it, learning about it, being taught by your finance professor about it. Having personally experienced unemployment should not affect your consumption behavior differently than knowing your risk of future unemployment. And living through a pandemic should be no different than knowing about likelihood and its implications. Of course, all of that controlling for wealth, income, etc. And the new models and empirical evidence on what we call experience effect challenge that. These theory and empirical papers argue that the personal experience of outcomes has a lasting impact on our beliefs and behavior. You may call it scarring effects, and link it to the biology or neuropsychiatry of what's going on in our body. Our brain changes, synapses are formed, and I'll talk a little bit about that later. Let me start from an example of what I'm talking about, which at least here in the US is very famous, the example of the depression babies. So the notion of what depression babies are about is that those who have lived through the Great Depression were confronted with headlines like the ones you see down here, particularly at relatively young age, growing up, young adults, stayed as a result of that away from the stock market for the rest of their lives and avoided all things risky, like the plague, as this quote here says. And when my co-author Stefan Nagel at Chicago and I started looking into that, whether that's true, first of all, we didn't find any existing research documenting it. But when we just went to the raw data using survey of consumer finance and getting stock market participation rates of people in the mid-30s to mid-40s and just plotted them out for starters, by 10-year cohorts. So cohorts are born up to 1920, 21 to 30, 31 to 40, etc., we saw a pattern. We saw, for starters, that the generation that has experienced the 1930s Great Depression as teenagers, young adults, display with 13% stock market participation, a probability of investing at least $1 in the stock market, that it's half or less than half than all later cohorts. Then you see it going up. I mean, there is a general upward trend, but there's a small peak for the 31 to 40 cohort who experienced the post-World War II boom years during their young adult lives. And then again, a little dip, 41 to 50s cohort, possibly consistent with the fact that they experienced the depression years of the 1970s at that age, the stagflation, etc. So we went out to ask whether, when we are trying to predict stock market participation, so whether person I at time T invest at least $1 in the stock market, and we throw in all these variables the economists know to throw in, right? Your income, your wealth, education, family status, etc., etc. But then add one more thing, which is this area of lambda, which I'll explain in a second more, which is basically a summary of all your lifetime experience so far. You can think about the average stock market return that has happened in your life so far. Do we get predictive power? So if we, make this an investor's lifetime stock market experience, does it predict YIT, their stock market investment? Or we can look at bond market experience and bond market investment. And to anticipate the result, we found a huge, statistically and economically very significant predictive power. So if I compare, for example, a person who has had was unlucky, born at the wrong time, right around crisis time, and it's kind of if I look at the whole distribution of the US population at the 10th percentile, meaning has had pretty bad stock market realizations, and I compare her to a person at the 90th percentile, person during his lifetime so far, the stock market has been doing fairly great. So this is this interdecile range here. I see that the model predicts a difference in 14 percentage points in stock market participation. And that's, again, an average. So this is 80 to 100 years of data we are using here, including the historical data. That's against an average of around 37% stock market participation. So, third to a half increase, which is very impressive, and quite similar for bond market participation. The average actually about the same for that time period, 36%, and the interdecile range effect is 15 percentage points. So people with pretty bad experiences compared to people with really good experiences behave very different, are much more, the ones with a good experience are so much more willing to be to participate in the stock market. Also, what we found is that there's no cross-fertilization. So, if we economists acknowledge at all that our lifetime experiences change our risk attitudes, our beliefs, and our investment decision, then, we would immediately go to a model where we think, okay, but, there's a whole covariance matrix. How do these assets relate to each other? And, whatever I learn in one market should apply to the other one if outcomes are correlated. Not happening. What people experience in one market affect their behavior in that market, but not in related markets. And to kind of formalize a little bit, if that's okay with you, how this works, what we found is that if we take a person I's lifetime experience, so all the returns, say take the S&P 500 or some broad-based index of the stock market from today, going back with lax K back to her birth year, and we weigh it with some weights, which we formulated as you see here on the right, which is basically a way to kind of allow the data to tell us whether people equal weight the experience or maybe put more weight on recent experience and less on earlier ones with some recency bias or vice versa, or U-shaped, hand-shaped, this other stuff we experimented with. So you see here for a hypothetical 50-year-old person how, if lambda equal to 1 in this formula, this person would put a lot of weight in what happened recently, today or a year ago, and then it would go down linearly to birth. It can be even steeper, lambda equal to 3. If you have lambda equal to 0, the person is equal weighting. Negative lambda means early impressions matter most. What we found is in many different data sets, what people tend to do is something pretty close to lambda equal to 1. So we take into account all of our lifetime experience and give them a little extra weight compared to our theoretical knowledge about other realizations. And it has some recency bias embedded. Recent realizations get most weight, but not in the sense economists have talked about it in the behavioral literature and otherwise in the past, like, oh, everybody puts extra weight on the last 1 year or 2 years or 6 months. So on. No, your whole lifetime matters. And it varies. If you're only 20 years old, it goes only here up to 20 years. And the line is much steeper. If you're 70 years old, it stretches out more. And that seems to be what gets you the most predictive power in people's beliefs and ultimately decision making. You can aggregate this stuff up. So you can now go, if you believe our estimates, to the whole US population, go to the census data, calculate every person's lifetime exposure to stock market returns, and then average over the whole US population, if you want, weighted by liquid assets. And then you get these red bars here. So these are the lifetime experiences of returns of the US population, in this case, 25 to 75-year-old, over time. And its ups and downs. And what we plotted here against this is the price earnings ratio, right? So if it's high, we're currently very excited we're bullish about stocks and the stock market and, valuing fairly highly. We're also likely to experience future declines, as I guess Schiller first taught us. And I plot that against these average experience returns in blue here. You don't need to do much, of an econometric analysis to see that they are highly correlated. So in other words, when the average experience of stock market outcomes has been pretty good in the population, market valuations go up. And if they have been pretty bad, market valuations are down. So what I'm trying to say with this back of the envelope calculation here, this stuff is important enough that it seems to aggregate up and help explain market level valuations. It can also explain, this got a little noisier, but I hope you can see it, who is participating in the market, right? So in economics and in thinking about retirement savings, etc., we have so much about life cycle stages and how at different ages we choose different forms of investment, have different, assets available to us, etc. But this focus on near age overlooks that a 60-year-old person today is different from a 60-year-old person 10 years ago and 20 years ago in terms of what they have experienced in their lives so far. So the way I'm trying to illustrate it here is if I compare above 60 and below 40, so that's my old versus young here, and I just calculate for all of them and average out for all of the above 60 and all of the above 40, their lifetime experience of stock market returns for all these different years you see here, 1995 and 1989, etc. So on the x-axis, I just calculate the difference, and then I plot it against their difference in stock market participation, log actually. I get this picture which indicates a positive correlation, meaning when older people have seen on average better market outcomes than younger people. So for example, we're just after a crisis, we're just in or just after the Great Recession, and the young people have not seen much other than kind of recession. So the average of older people's experience is better. Well, then there are more older people investing in the stock market compared to younger people. But there are other times, during boom times, just after boom times, young people have seen nothing but good returns. Their average is higher than that of older people, have also seen worse times. And so then we see more young people represented in the stock market. So it's not all about age, not all about life cycle. It matters what cohort you're looking at, what generation we are talking about. Overall, I don't want to walk you through all the little details for this keynote of our findings, but what has emerged from research in stock market, bond market, IPO investment, inflation experiences, mortgage choices, etc., is that in these specific market experiences we've personally lived through have a really long-lasting effect on our beliefs and choices. So we need to acknowledge that different cohorts are different depending on where they're at in terms of their lifetime experiences. These experiences are domain specific, so there's very little cross-fertilization across different realms of economic decisions. And however, the pattern is very similar. It's always this roughly linearly declining weights in all these different markets we have been looking at. The extent of the exposure matters. So if people in different locations are affected more strongly than at other locations, say by unemployment, or people are by gender or by race differently affected. Think about COVID-19, how different ethnicities, races were most strongly affected, how maybe, women with young kids had a heavier load to carry throughout this pandemic than men on average, or maybe women at other ages. These are differences which won't be erased once we are back to pre-COVID-19. These are differences that will affect them in the long run with possible implications for inequality. And the last one, which is always particularly interesting for economists, is that this effect seems to be pretty impervious, if I may say, to learned theoretical knowledge. Or to put it differently, experience effects are measurable and are seen even among experts. So let me illustrate that with the example of inflation experiences and how they affect inflation beliefs, which clearly, my co-author on many of these projects, Stefan Nagel and I, were both German, and both of us growing up with these types of pictures of kids playing with worthless Reichsmark bundles and so on in our history textbooks certainly played a role here. But, we're actually using US data, and apart from the current experience, the last experience of high inflation in the 1980s was one Paul Volcker was trying to combat. And what he said at the time really nicely captures what my talk is about. He was talking about how, as he's fighting to get back to price stability, he doesn't know how to convince a generation of young adults that has grown up since the mid-1960s knowing only inflation. Indeed, an inflation that has seemed to keep accelerating. That's exactly what we're about. It's not about understanding certain measures or not understanding, being trained in economics versus not. If you've only seen inflation around you, it's hard to imagine that price stability can really come back. So we first studied that, before I get to my experts, on the MSC, the Michigan Survey of Consumers data, looking at individual inflation expectations, right? There's this question, what do you expect 1 year inflation to be? And related the answer people gave to their historical exposure to inflation. So it's pretty similar, if you know these models, to these adaptive learning models, confogain learning of Marset and Sargent, Bray, and others. The only difference is that we allow people to put more weight on realizations that happen during their lifetimes. And so then we asked, well, does that predict what they say to that question, how do you expect inflation to be over the next year? Found again that personal experience matter, found again a very similar pattern. I mean, these are AR1 process, but if you try to translate it to a simple means perspective, it's roughly linearly declining weights. And we also showed in the paper that there are significant implications of these distorted beliefs on borrowing and lending, mortgage borrowing, etc. But so to kind of just illustrate it for a second, here's raw data on what people say 1 year ahead inflation will be over the next year, plotted from the 1950s to 2010. And I'm splitting up in black people below 40, and red 40 to 60, and in blue above 60. However, I'm not plotting the actual answer. I'm taking out the population mean. So meaning, of course, as we're going from 1970 to 1980, everybody was expecting inflation to be higher and higher and higher. I'm taking out this mean because I just want to illustrate the cross-sectional differences. And what you can see is that sometimes the young folks are more pessimistic than the older folks, but sometimes it reverses, sometimes the blue dots are on top. You also see that there are peaks of varying strength, and that they, in fact, can be really large. And in 1980, there's a 3 percentage points difference in people's perceptions or beliefs about future inflation, which we would be totally missing out on if you're just trying to fit our models to the mean or median forecast. If you now estimate our model, does past experience predict future inflation, and then plot the fitted values against this raw data, you do have a pretty nice fit. I mean, it's not perfect, but you can see by these kind of solid and dashed lines, which are the fitted values, the predicted values from our model, you can see that it gets the reversals when the young are more pessimistic and the old. You get the 2 peaks here. It's not perfect. I wish, our peak in 1980 would have been higher. But I think with better data, this, if you know the Michigan survey, that's repeated cross-section or panel, there's a good chance even those could have been captured. All right. So now finally to my experts I want to talk about. After we wrote this paper, we asked, well, can we see that even in experts? Can we see that even in, say, FOMC members, the guys that have had governors and regional presidents who decide over rates in their FOMC meetings? And the nicest case of it, my favorite anecdote I like to share, is a guy who was actually born in Germany as Heinrich Wallich, born in 1914 to family of bankers, grew up in Berlin, lived through Germany's hyperinflation, and then emigrated to the US in 1930s, where he became a successful Fed governor, also got a PhD. At this point, he became Henry Wallich. And he, having experienced Germany's hyperinflation, kept dissenting in these meetings on whether they decide about the rates, and kept declaring people don't understand how bad inflation is, that's around the corner, that we need to prevent it, etc. So I believe that with him dissenting 27 times during his tenure, he still holds the records in Federal Reserve history. And that's somebody who's clearly smart, educated, has all the available data at his fingertips, knows that this is the US, not Germany, right? It's not about doing some, having biased beliefs in terms of doing something where he doesn't understand the math or doesn't have the cognition. And yet it affected him. Not only him, so just kind of to generalize quickly, if I look at all the FOMC members, and plot their forecast of one-year inflation from the semi-annual monetary policy reports to Congress, here on the y-axis, against the experience of inflation or experience-based forecast according to our model, normalized by the staff forecast to take out a year effect, you see a very strong positive correlation. Again, you don't need to do a lot of econometrics there to kind of to see that personal positive inflation experience, having experienced more inflation, leads them to have the stronger beliefs about higher future inflation going forward. And, this is within FOMC members where I don't have a lot of heterogeneity to work with, until recently these were all white men of a certain age. Now there's some women, some younger members mixed in. But despite this relatively small differences in inflation experiences, we find predictive power here, which in turn translates into actual voting behavior. So here, for example, we are plotting the dissent probabilities, either dovish dissent, so people saying, well, we should care more about unemployment, let's not raise rates so much, and hawkish dissents, the Wallich type, let's push up the rates, we need to prevent in inflation. And so these are just the averages, 2.5 to 4% of dissent probability over the history of the Fed since Fed independence in 1951. And so if I now ask what's the predicted dissent probability for a person with the one standard deviation within year standard deviation increase in personal experience of inflation, which is just 0.1 percentage points. Again, these people are pretty homogeneous, unfortunate. And yet, I find that the dovish dissent probability, the predicted dovish dissent probability goes down by a quarter to a third, and the hawkish dissent probability goes up by about a quarter. So it really affects the actual behavior in these decision-making meetings. And so that leaves us with the insight that, our traditional economic focus on trying to understand why people have biased beliefs, our traditional economic focus on, do I have access to information or not? Am I educated? Am I taught? Do I know? Might be a little bit too limiting. So it's not all about access to information, right? Henry Wallich and the FOMC members do have this information at their fingertips. Also, by focusing on these experts, and there's similar papers on fund managers and bankers and highly educated physicians being overly affected by their personal experience, cast some doubt on the simple behavioral channels, such as, there's over-inference because people can't do the Bayesian thing right. So if I put it into the computer, realm, it's not the input, what we're typing in the information. It's maybe also not that the software has some flaws. There's something happening to our, if I may put it that way, hardware, to our brains as we are living through these experiences. And the modern evidence from neuroscience and cognitive science on neuroplasticity is actually quite consistent with the story I've been telling. So we now know that as we're walking through life and are making new experiences, our brain keeps forming connections between two neurons. There's some firing, there's some synapses being formed, which tell us how to, react to the world around us, governs the way we experience life. And this reorganization of pathways and creating of new connections, even creating of new neurons in response to our learning, our experiences, memory foundation, happens all through life. So we used to think it happens mostly when we're young, and it is happening more strongly then, hence as parents trying to influence, our kids and educate them to form the right neural pathways in some sense, but it doesn't stop. The brain never stops changing. Importantly, for our context here, it matters how and how often we make an experience. So repeated stimulation of the hippocampal neurons, so the part here, so the part which looks like, hippocampus is like the sea monster, is particularly strong and can be prolonged if the exposure has been particularly often repeated or has been particularly strong, particularly striking. So this concept of long-term potentiation, which was already discussed in the late 1990s, and where there's ongoing research on what's happening to these synapses where they formed a connection particularly often, a synaptic tagging. What is particularly interesting here is the research actually on trauma, on synaptic changes caused by traumatic stress, and taking that a little bit more into economics, I think could be quite helpful. To be a little bit extreme for just a second, if you think about a soldier traumatized by war, coming home and then reacting to the noise of a car starting, being startled or even jumping up or hiding under the table because the noise reminds him of the noise of bombing, shelling, etc. That person doesn't need to have been told more information of how unlikely it is this to happen. I would also not say, he's making some mistake in weighing past, realizations. No, it's some automaticity. It's something that has been restructured in his brain and will lead him to go to these realizations when making decisions. And while I to finish this up, while I've been talking a lot about realizations, economic realizations, where maybe the link to trauma, it kind of seems quite plausible. So the German hyperinflation, the Great Depression, the pandemic, that we might want to call that trauma, and increasingly neuroscientists do think about economic and financial trauma as a more important dimension than maybe previously thought. That seems maybe agreeable. What is a little bit harder is that there's not only that big T trauma, as neuropsychiatrists call it, but also small T trauma. So in the psychology, psychiatry literature, it's about, the daily paper cuts, the daily slides, for example, related to discrimination, which affects people and leads to, traumatization, which can be just as striking and strong in their effect, and often much harder to treat and harder, also partly because harder to stop, harder to identify in psychiatry. Now, I think that translates to finance and economics. So the daily exposure or daily worry about being able to get food insecurity, prices, increasing prices, inflation, as we have right now, unemployment, those can lead, even if we're not in a humongous crisis like the Great Depression, to, if repeated often enough, if long-lasting enough, can really reshape how our brain functions, what we immediately go to when we hear, when we notice prices in the grocery store, etc. Now, this happens not only on the negative side, which I'm focusing a lot in my talk, frankly, because it gives me good identification, but also on the positive side. But I do want to illustrate it with one last example, and then I'll conclude, which relates to gender and experiences. So my example of the small T trauma are basically grocery prices, and not grocery prices, right now where there's lots of reporting in the news as inflation is climbing up. This is actually data when we are still near the zero lower bound, we had very little inflation. So I should start from saying that for decades, the Fed has people at the Fed knew that there's this interesting pattern that women seem to believe that future inflation will be higher compared to men on average. So at times of somewhat higher inflation, it might be like 2 percentage points. even at times where we were, at very close to zero, the zero lower bound times, there were differences in inflation of about 0.5, longer horizons, 1 percentage points. So that has been going on for decades. It's in the US. There's a Swedish data from like 40 years ago, which documented it in Sweden. So why is it that women, on average, tend to have higher inflation expectations? So people have, speculated maybe women are more pessimistic, maybe it's lack of financial education, although unclear why it goes in that direction. Well, what we asked is, could it be related to grocery shopping and, in that traditional gender roles, women doing more of the grocery shopping? So we know, groceries, food, and like energy is highly volatile. In fact, that's why it's often taken out of the core CPI measure, because it's so confusing if you want to understand inflation trends. And we also know from previous research that when people see volatile prices, they tend to anchor a lot on the upswings and put less weight on the downswings. So if you expose people to lots of volatile prices, they tend to, increase their inflation expectations. In other words, we asked, well, if you send a woman a lot to the grocery store and she sees all these fluctuation in prices, might that be the reason why she gets really, really worried about future inflation, future price increases? So we were able to combine the Nielsen data on individual level, household level grocery shopping with the survey on inflation expectations and included the question. So we looked at heterosexual households and asked the male and the female head of household, well, do you do any grocery shopping for your household? Are you the main grocery shopper? Do you do at least any? And in the households where the man does not do any grocery shopping, yes, we replicated that they have at that time, 0.6 to 0.7 percentage point higher inflation expectations. When we went to the households where the men do at least some of the grocery shopping, it completely disappeared. So it seems like it's not something ingrained, it's not education, it's not financial literacy, etc. It's just the difference in daily signal, daily exposure to prices that seems to cause these long-run differences, persistent differences in beliefs. So to conclude, I hope that you take away from my talk today that there's increasing evidence on very long-lasting and strong effects of personal experiences on beliefs and risk-taking. Some of my colleagues call this research agenda econ PTSD, and that's not too wrong, given the link to trauma. In a nutshell, you can think about it as if when we economists try to predict some outcome variable, YTI, say consumption expenditure, with a vector of, predictors, income, wealth, education, etc., which we are pretty sure play a role. Well, pause and consider not just looking at this vector, but looking at the whole matrix that includes past realization your person I has lived through. Even if her income and wealth is in pretty good shape right now, if she's grown up in poverty, if she has seen unemployment, insecurity in her parents or herself early in her life, that will stay with her. And that is something we should take into account and not just focus on, it's about age, it's about, current variables and forward-looking variables. Backward-looking is extremely powerful. And the good news is we're increasingly able to do it, right? We're increasingly able to scrape big data, big within-person data, and the broad applicability to settings in macro labor, finance, there's research in political economy suggests we should maybe more try to do that. As you can imagine, the welfare and policy implications are quite different from traditional economics. It's not about information campaigns, about financial literacy. It's about exposing people to experiences to let them see the world in a different way. And I'll stop here.
Thank you so much. That was really interesting. I'm going to take the prerogative to ask the first question, which is a combination of questions that Olivia and I sort of had together. And it's really, how should organizations like AARP that communicate directly with consumers, or even financial institutions who are working with people saving for retirement, how can they understand this scarring and tailor messages that may be really helpful for people saving for retirement? I'm worried one takeaway could be, once you're scarred for life. And I'm curious if there's anything we can do to help really change those mindsets. And then I'm going to turn, we've got about 4 questions in the Q&A after you answer this.
Yeah, no, excellent question, one I'm thinking a lot about. I want to say two things before I directly answer it. I do want to say that simply just acknowledging where people come from. So it's either for themselves. So like I observe myself, despite having all the knowledge about finance, maybe making some financial decisions which are a little different. I don't know, putting more into fixed rate assets compared to the stock market than I would prescribe to my students, and to kind of pause and think about where I came from, what my experiences were, and that's what's influencing me instead of beating up on myself. I think that can already be quite helpful, just kind of to understand kind of what motivates you. And then the same for firms and funds, like working with consumers instead of putting them in the same box. Well, at this age, you should obviously do so and so. Say, okay, you are that generation that just when graduating from college experienced the Great Recession, where, if you had any portfolio, it went poof and like there were no jobs available, etc. And kind of taking that into account instead of having your typical schema for, this age group, I think can be helpful in being able to communicate with people and get to them. But your actual question was about, well, what about if we want to change things and help people make better decisions, because maybe they're currently shying away too much from, say, the stock market and forgoing the equity premium puzzle in their long run savings, etc. And so, you're right to ask, well, are you saying they're scarred for life and there's nothing we can do? Well, not quite. So the original notion of depression babies, I think, sounded a little bit like that, right? These people live through the Great Depression, nothing you can do. They're not going to enter the stock market ever. But our research says, well, that's not quite true. It is true that me teaching them about finance and diversification and so on, that won't help, right? Because it's like emotionally anchored in their brain. But what could help is if I manage to find a way to invite them to expose themselves to stock market experiences in a non-threatening way. So very much like, cognitive behavioral therapy, but for stock market investment. So my policy prescription would be give people $50, $100, encourage them, or subsidize even, right? Encourage them to invest a small amount in a broad-based, low-fee index and put it there and see how after a year or 2 years they feel about it, right? Sounds very touchy-feely for a finance professor, but that's actually really what I think would help. So as you're personally accumulating different experiences, your brain is going to reframe things and going to start thinking differently about the stock market. So either us ourselves designing our personal experiences, or financial advisors, financial institutions helping us and encouraging us, policymakers possibly subsidizing or otherwise setting incentives to generate these counterbalancing experiences would be much more the way to go. And just one last word on that. I know you want to get some other questions on that, but there is this long literature in labor economics on the importance of role models. So when people talk about, having female STEM professors or having same minority ethnicity TAs in certain fields, and how the impact on people then really pursuing these fields is so strong. So this is not quite yet your own personal experience, but pretty close. I see somebody who looks like me and does something and it's working out for them. And that just seems to be so much more powerful than knowing, I qualify for this program. I could apply to a PhD or an MBA or whatever we are talking about. So I think there's quite a lot of evidence that suggests we can change the way we think about it, but it has to be more visceral, more emotionally anchored and resonate with us. And so that's what I would also recommend in finance.
Thank you. Anna Rappaport has a great question about whether recent experiences are more salient than ones that happened a long period ago, or the vice versa.
Yeah, well, that's an excellent question. So I can tell you first what we know so far from the data, but then also some speculations of what else might be still to be identified in the data. So from what I showed you before, if you remember that graph of the 50-year-old person who was putting a lot of weight on what happened recently and less on stuff in the past, that graph implies that there's extra weight. There's always extra weight on recent experience compared to things that happened a long time ago. They do get downweighted over time. And that also speaks to Deb's question earlier, right? We're not forever scarred. They do get downweighted and they get kind of replaced with this new experiences. And that seems to be quite true across many different settings. And there's also a long, history of research on recency bias that would be consistent with that. Just the new angle is stuff in the past does matter too, even if with less weight, and your age matters, right? So if you are like a 50-year-old person, maybe the weighting is pretty flat. If you're a 20-year-old person, right, you've had a very small experience, then the recent stuff really, really matters and gets a lot of weight because, you've only 20 years to look at. Having said all of that, so that's what came out of, us looking at stock market, bond market, unemployment experience, like different markets. But I'm also really trying to take seriously studying the evidence from, biology and neuroscience and cognitive science. There is a notion of, us being reminded of a past experience. There's a saying in English, how is it? Burnt twice, something, like, that it can have like an over proportional effect. So for example, think right now about the inflation. People have lived through the 1980s inflation, other people who immediately, reacted to it, and other ones commenting on it in the news, etc. So that it might remind you and might revive this past experience. So kind of a little bit of a more than proportional effect, according to my weighting function, I think might be true. And we might just not have had the granular enough data to detect it yet. So still working on that, although I do think that the recency bias will surely survive.
All right, I think we're ending at 12:25. So let me just ask you one last quick question from Larry Santanucci, which is not everybody experiences, I'm going to summarize, not everybody has something bad happen to them. Sometimes not everybody loses a job, but they might see a lot of other people losing a job. And so how are people affected either positively or negatively when they're not hit by economic downturn, a job loss, or other negative effect?
Yeah, that's another super interesting question. So for starters, despite me calling it experience effects and talking about personal experiences, it doesn't need to be actually personal, and like in the sense of me losing the job. It can also be somebody close to me, or I observe it around it, etc. So in our study on scarred consumption, where we look at the effect on unemployment experiences on consumption spending, well, if it's me who had this experience with my parents or myself, I mean, in the past, now my wealth income is all good, then it's the strongest effect. If it's in an area closely around me, the second strongest. But even, nationwide, bad news about unemployment going up has an impact on me. So what we think right now it would be the true metric of how much other people's experiences affect me, something we're calling information resonance. I'm working with Laura Feldkamp on that. Says that, ultimately, what I would love to know is how strongly it's anchored in your brain, right? How these neurons are firing, how strong the synapse is, etc. And we know it has something to do with how emotionally it's anchored, what you feel in that moment, not the objective informational value, how that person's unemployment experience correlates with your personal risk. That doesn't matter. It matters somewhat, but it matters a lot how it resonates. And so what predicts that it resonates? Well, it seems that if you are socially close to that person, so close along dimensions such as gender, race, ethnicity. For women, it seems to be a lot similar parental status or similar work versus family kind of status. That is a strong predictor of what resonates with you. And you saw that a lot trying to be used in the COVID-19 pandemic and in campaigns about vaccination, right? Where people realize, I might know Fauci is a super expert and I might actually believe what he says. But if I'm a member of, the typical example would have been like an African-American community, and I see my local priests getting the vaccine, this is just so much more powerful. So the CDC really tried to be serious about that and bring people who resonate with you, who look similar to you along some dimensions into the community. And I think those are the experiences that are almost like own experiences, if that makes sense.